President Trump is forced out of his political comfort zone and into the role of consoler-in-chief as he tours flood-ravaged central Texas. Meanwhile, in a remarkable policy shift, Trump resumes weapons shipments to Ukraine after changing his tune on Russia's president.
I'm not happy with Putin. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
Tonight, how a national tragedy and a defiant Putin are threatening President Trump's agenda and exposing growing tensions with his base. Next.
This is Washington Week with The Atlantic. Corporate funding provided by...
In 1995, two friends set out to make wireless coverage accessible to all. With no long-term contracts, nationwide coverage, and 100% U.S.-based customer support. Consumer Cellular. Freedom calls.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan for the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, Charles Hamawi through the Charles Hamawi Fund, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. And now from the David M. Rubenstein studio at WETA in Washington, here is Washington Week with The Atlantic.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. I'm Ashley Parker, in tonight for Jeffrey Goldberg. President Trump has wrapped up his tour of Central Texas, where he met with state officials and those affected by last week's devastating floods. It's a side of Trump that we don't often see, that of consoler-in-chief. But we also saw another side of the president this week, one who seems to be fed up with Vladimir Putin. Joining me tonight to discuss all things Trump are Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent at the New York Times. Tarini Parti is a White House reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Zolan Kanno-Youngs is a White House correspondent at the New York Times, and Nancy Youssef is a staff writer at The Atlantic. Thank you guys all for being here, and let's just jump right in. I am actually old enough to remember George W. Bush comforting the first responders at Ground Zero after September 11th, and Barack Obama spontaneously breaking into amazing grace after the deadly shooting at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I also remember President Trump throwing paper towels when touring hurricane damage in Puerto Rico during his first term. And Peter, you're even older than I am.
A little bit.
You have, unfortunately, just a little. But yes, you have covered 6 presidencies, starting with Bill Clinton. How does President Trump compare to his predecessors in this role as consoler-in-chief?
Yeah, this is not his strength, right? President Trump has a lot of strengths. Consoling people, not one of them. Empathy, not one of them. You're right, I've been covering presidents going to disaster zones since President Clinton. I remember traveling with him to a big giant flood in Grand Forks, North Dakota was my first one. And what presidents from Clinton on have always done, of course, is to find ways to connect with people on the ground, to show that they're there, that they not only are going to bring resources to the federal government, but they understand their plight. And that's just not where Trump is. He is sometimes very good at mobilizing resources, but he is not good, I think, at connecting people who are in pain.
Although today in Texas, we did see a version of him doing this. Let's watch.
I've gone to a lot of hurricanes, a lot of tornadoes. I've never seen anything like this. This is a bad one. We just visited with incredible families that, I mean, look, they've been devastated. They lost their child or 2 children, and just hard to believe what, I've never seen anything like it.
I mean, so no paper towels this time. Tarini, is this a side of the president we just don't see? Is he growing into the role?
He was more empathetic than we've seen him in the past. And what we saw in the last few days is Secretary Kristi Noem talking to him, telling him stories about what she had seen on the ground. And you could tell he had been, moved by the tragedies at the camp in particular, and he brought that up today. So it was a different side of him. But he also wanted to, of course, tout his administration's response, which is different from what we've seen how other administrations have handled it. It's been a very scaled back federal response. They're relying more on state and local officials. And he also tried to make that point, that even though they're doing things differently, that in his view, this has been a success, even though there are still a lot of people missing, and search and rescue teams are still looking for them.
There's almost like two sort of wings to a president's response when it comes to a disaster. The rhetoric and the empathizer in chief, but then also you mentioned mobilizing resources. That's the other part of it. And I think we have to look at President Trump's record with FEMA in its entirety in this second term. I traveled with him to North Carolina, and then he went to California in his first week in office. And yeah, he had some of those moments of empathy and interacting with some of these people who were suffering. He also mused about shuttering the nation's disaster relief agency. In his time in office in the second term, a large portion of workers from FEMA have also lost their jobs at this point. The Department of Homeland Security, we wrote a story that they were reviewing grants ranging from supporting police departments to disaster resilience, and basically reviewing whether localities were aligned with the administration's DEI and immigration agenda in order to continue giving out those grants. Kristi Noem is facing a lot of criticism right now for a new rule in which grants above $100,000 she actually needs to review, and people are citing that new rule in basically claiming a slowed down response here. We won't know and really the grade of the federal government's response to this disaster for some time. It's still very soon. But all of these reasons are why the administration might be facing more questions and scrutiny than usual. It's the president's comments before the disaster as well as what we saw today.
Right. Oh, sorry. It looks like you're going to say something.
No,
I was going to say, you're right. I mean, the administration can't stop a flood. But this was a failure of preparedness. And what struck me this week is how much we've been talking about response by government, not only on the federal level, but at the local level, starting all the way from when the camp built these new facilities using this $5 million grant a few years ago, even though it was in floodplains. Local officials not willing to answer questions about the systems they had in place to respond to this and whether they were adequate on the state level and, as you point out, on the federal level. And what's been interesting to me in watching the coverage is people mentioning actually names of people who could have made a difference. The National Weather Service, for example, Paul Ura, who was in charge of sort of responsiveness for that area, had retired just last year after 32 years in service. And so it's been striking to me how much we've been looking at responsiveness across government and not able to really get at what level the system broke down and what needs to be done going forward to make those fixes.
Well, and in a moment where Trump has talked about abolishing FEMA, this would certainly seem to call for FEMA to, at the very least, exist. Peter, is there any change of thinking in the White House about the role of FEMA at all?
Yeah, you saw them backing off that, right? So the president had said he would phase it out. That was his phrase, by the end of the year. Now they're not talking about that so much. Russ Vought, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, told reporters today, no, we're just going to reform it. We're not going to get rid of it. We're going to make it better. Okay, well, fine. That's a different story. But it reminds us that FEMA has a role. And it's true that conservatives historically believe the best government is the government that is at the closest to the people, right? State and local governments. But FEMA is one of the agencies that Republican governors like a lot, just like Democratic governors. Every disaster I've ever been to with those presidents, I've seen governors on the ground of both parties really glad that FEMA was there. They don't want less FEMA. They want more FEMA. And maybe it doesn't work all the way they want it to, but they don't want it to go away because FEMA can do things, the federal government can do things that states and localities can't.
Right, and in some ways, FEMA coordinates with their state partners. On Tuesday, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem spoke in a cabinet meeting where she outlined what she tried to describe as a new sort of FEMA. Let's take a listen.
But as soon as you signed the major disaster declaration, we were able to get them resources and dollars right away, just like you envisioned through state block grants, to help them with cleanup. And FEMA's been deployed, and we're cutting through the paperwork of the old FEMA, streamlining it much like your vision of how FEMA should operate, and it's been a much better response to help these families get through this terrible situation.
But Tarini, in some ways, when I hear that, isn't she just describing old FEMA?
She is, and she's actually leaving out what actually happened. So based on our reporting, we know that at DHS, there was widespread confusion about how they should respond, how they should move resources, in part because of that that rule that Zolan mentioned, where Kristi Noem has to review any spending over $100,000, they also didn't pre-position assets close to the impacted area as they have done in past disasters. So they weren't able to quickly move assets and resources in. They didn't have search and rescue teams out until Monday. This was 3 days after the flooding had started. And so there are concerns within the agency about the slowing down effect. And even if we didn't see the gaps so much in this case, because it was a small area, because this wasn't, a major hurricane as we might see in the coming weeks and months, that it didn't show as much. And also, Texas is one of the states that has sort of a more bolstered state emergency response system. So other states might not have the types of resources that Texas does. So in this case, we didn't see maybe some of the gaps that Kristi Noem was trying to tout, but we might in the future.
Right, and Texas has that infrastructure. It's a big state, it's a red state. And even with that, Texas Governor Greg Abbott almost immediately called in FEMA, right? So it makes you wonder, how would a smaller state fare, Zolan, or perhaps most especially a blue state?
Sure. No, absolutely. I mean, this is a state. We did a FOIA project, a Freedom of Information Act project, where we got a lot of documents in 2019 and actually compared how FEMA's response was to U.S. territories compared to a place like Texas. And Texas historically got more support faster than many other places in the United States. And if they had questions at this point, you have to, again, wonder how a small community would fare that's going to rely on this federal agency more. Also, the president has usually disaster response for a president, there's some unwritten rules. The partisanship goes away. The support is there without strings attached. But there have been times where, if you looked at the president's comments, even from his first term, where you see that transactional approach also through a lens of disaster relief, a sense of this support is coming your way, but also what do you owe me? Again, first week when he's in office, he goes to California, a place where he had previously threatened no relief for their wildfire response. And he goes and he says the federal government will be here for you. I also want these immigration actions to take place. I also want this and that. I want, you to turn over. I want you to adopt my agenda in a way. So, will we see that? We'll have to see. But again, to Tarini's point, this is going to keep coming up. The administration has pushed back on reporters asking questions and interrogating this response. Well, part of the reason for that is also it's hurricane season, right? And we're going to see this happen more and more.
Right, and Peter, I want to be careful about not implying causation between the doging of the federal government and the tragedy we saw in Central Texas. But is there a world in which this changes their thinking? Or if not, what do these massive cuts sort of throughout the bureaucracy portend for future disasters?
I mean, it raises all kinds of questions. National Weather Service, obviously, National Oceanographic Association agency, atmospheric agency that predicts climate change patterns and so forth, and whether it had anything to do with this one or not, people will give us a better account of that in the days and weeks to come. But you can see in the future why that might be something of concern for people, because they did know that there were potential flood disaster happening here, and yet despite that didn't have the preparation, didn't have the warning systems and all that. And if you have a FEMA that's already 1/4 smaller than it was a couple months ago, that's, some cuts may be perfectly good in terms of efficiency of waste, but 1/4 is a large chunk out of a federal agency that you want to do more, not less.
Right, and Tarini, you mentioned some of these gaps that were not as acute because Texas was better prepared, but you've done a lot of reporting on FEMA. Can you take us through a scenario where these gaps might be more pronounced? And as much as Kristi Noem did describe a FEMA as it exists, they are trying to make some changes, and can you explain to us what that will actually look like?
Yeah, they're trying to make a lot of changes, and staffing in particular has been a big focus. But this $100,000 review that we keep bringing up over and over again is a big deal, because during a major hurricane, we've been told you can spend, the government spends hundreds of millions of dollars in such a short amount of time. You can spend $1 billion within days. And so getting approval for every little thing that the government spends money on could really potentially cause lives in this type of situation. What they've also gotten rid of is door-to-door services, where FEMA staff goes to an impacted area and knocks on doors and tries to help survivors. So that has been, taken away. We also don't know if they're going to be doing what I described earlier as pre-positioning of these assets, which was something that came out of Hurricane Katrina as sort of a big lesson learned, which is to go big and go quickly and early as much as possible to try to be as prepared. Even if it costs the government more money, those resources are there in case the state and local officials need them.
And another surprise out of the White House this week was Trump changing his tone on Russia and specifically really changing his tone on President Putin. I mean, it was not even, feels like years ago, but it was not even 5 months ago that Trump got so upset with Ukrainian President Zelensky that he essentially threw him out of the White House before he had time to eat his scheduled lunch. So let's just take a quick trip down memory lane.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having
I'm not playing cards.
Right now, you don't.
You're
playing cards.
Mr. President.
You're playing cards.
Serious.
You're gambling with the lives of
war.
millions of people. You're
You
gambling with World War III.
But on Tuesday, Trump had this to say about Putin.
We get a lot of thrown at us by Putin, for you want to know the truth. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
So, Peter, what has changed? Has Trump come around to Zelensky? Has he soured on Putin? Is it something we can't even fathom yet?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. You know why Zelensky got under Trump's skin at that thing a few months ago? Because he was telling him Putin is going to shovel a lot of BS your way, that you cannot trust Putin. And Trump took offense at that. He says, no, that's just not true. In effect, what he's saying is, I've been through so much with my friend Vladimir Putin. We went through the Russia hoax together, blah, blah, blah. And now what Trump has discovered is what Zelensky told him is basically right. You cannot assume that Putin is your friend. You cannot assume that he wants a peace deal, because he doesn't. He's made that very clear. Now, it's striking to hear Trump say what he said this week because of 10 years of bromance between the two, right? Which is still seemingly inexplicable to a lot of people. Why would Trump be so favorable toward Putin for so long? Has he come around to believe what everybody else already believed, which is that Putin is not his friend?
Which his own intelligence services have been telling him since his first term for the better part of a decade.
And his friends like Lindsey Graham and other Republicans would tell him, Marco Rubio used to be a hawk. He would tell, the old Senator Rubio would have told him that. I don't know about Secretary Rubio. Now, does that mean that they'll stay, estranged? We've seen with Trump before, of course. He has, he goes in and out with people, right? He gets mad at people and then they're back into his orbit. So if they had a deal next week of some sort that Trump could tout, he would suddenly be friends again, probably with Putin. But it is interesting that he has learned that Putin is not the guy he thought he was. And it's important to remember that Trump thought they were so close that he could snap his fingers and have a peace deal within 24 hours, he told everybody. Not even after his inauguration. He said he could do it before his inauguration, and he's discovered otherwise.
Right, and Nancy, one thing that was striking was Trump says this, but this week, after Trump's comments, Russia and Putin ramp up their attacks on Ukraine. Can you take us through why Putin still seems to feel so emboldened?
Well, so what's happening on the ground is we've seen a huge uptick of the use of drones and missiles on the Capitol, killing at least 14, literally hundreds of drones. And then today we saw an attack on a maternity hospital in Kharkiv. And this is, when I give you a sense of sort of the level, the ramp up, we've seen more drones used in some cases in one day than all of last year by Russia. And what that does is really overwhelm the air defense system of Ukraine at a time when the U.S. has withheld the air defense missiles that would protect the capital and other parts of the country. And I think he's doing this in part because he sees a Ukraine that is increasingly vulnerable because it's drawing down on the U.S. provided air defense missiles, and potentially sees a divide between the United States and Ukraine in terms of the promise of enduring support. That these attacks have happened more on the Capitol, have been so aggressive, and have really forced Ukraine to make big decisions about what air defense capability they're going to use to try to protect the Capitol has been challenging.
You mentioned those defensive weapons, which Trump just sort of reauthorized the shipment of, but those had been stopped briefly by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, it is worth noting, without telling Trump what he was doing. They're now back on, but this sort of on-again, off-again defensive weapons dance. I mean, what does that reveal about fissures between the president and Hegseth, fissures in the administration? Nancy, let's stick with you for a second. Explain what we should take away from that.
So just a little background. Under the Biden administration, there was a promise of consistent weapon shipments to Ukraine, and those were supposed to run out about the summer. And so this was one of those shipments and it included things like Patriot missiles, Hellfires, Gimlers, key weapons systems and missiles for Ukraine. And so we heard at the start of the month that the Secretary of Defense had suspended those, seemingly without telling the president. The president said he didn't know. It's not even clear whether the whole shipment was suspended. When you ask at the Pentagon, shockingly, you can't get a clear answer on what was suspended, why, and what is resuming now. So then we heard from the president, I don't know, but I want to resume them. He gave an interview to NBC in which he said, we are actually going to resume this shipment of defensive weapons and NATO's going to pay for it. Now, technically, NATO can't pay for it, but NATO members could. And so we're looking now to see if that's going to happen and what that package looks like. The problem is so many people focus on the shipment and what Hegseth said. To me, what's critical is once you start turning weapon systems on and shipments on and off, it is very hard for Ukrainian military planners to defend themselves. You know, when you turn off a missile system, there's a lot of logistical changes that happen. Ukraine might move a system from one part of the country and the other. When 2 days later, the U.S. turns it back on, those systems are still on trains. They're having to reconfigure their battlefield to this on and off approach to U.S. shipments.
Right, and you're giving us an explanation of us now 7 months into this conflict in Trump's term, but Peter had mentioned that Trump had said he was going to do this on day one. And Zolan, I'm curious, I know you had some reporting on this. Trump actually believed this. Can you just explain why he believed this?
I mean, I don't know about the 24 hours. I have talked to people who really think that Trump did think that his relationship with Putin, that the fact that Putin favored him over other candidates, that he could use that leverage, his deal-making leverage, to get a deal here. And what he has found out is that embracing Vladimir Putin comes with few results. It comes with few actual productive results here. And it's something that, yes, you know, he was saying to those around him, but his Republican allies, you know, were also telling him in recent weeks that they could all be getting played. This was something that Senator Graham said as well, who's put forth a sanctions bill that we still don't really know if the White House supports at this point. It would impose sanctions on Russia. So, you know, he has had reminders that Putin could be playing him this entire time. And now you're starting to see the frustration really bubble up to the surface after a lot of the hyperbolic rhetoric that we saw during the campaign.
So I'm so glad you brought up the sanctions bill, because I think despite what we heard from the president, to me, we will not know if there's a real shift unless two things happen. One, we actually see weapons and defensive systems going to Ukraine, and the president signs that sanctions bill. That is a tangible example of the president saying, I am fed up with Putin. Words are one thing, but those are the two things on the table right now that would signal that actually the U.S. is shifting its position.
And after he posted on Truth Social that Putin had gone crazy after, or lost his mind after one of Russia's aggressive attacks on Ukraine, I asked him, outside of Air Force One, if he supported his own allies' sanctions bill. And at that point, he did not say one way or the other. He said, I have to read it. I'm not sure. He didn't answer the affirmative. He's been asked since then as well. Still, we have not had that outright support for the bill.
Well, that sanctions bill has a cost, because what it does is it tries to cut off the oil supply to places like China. It doesn't want other people to buy Russian oil. That's fine. But if you take that oil off the market, it means prices go up. And that's why Biden's administration wasn't willing to do that. They did a whole lot of other sanctions, but they weren't willing to take all the Russian oil off the market because of the price at the gas pump. And Trump is very sensitive to the price of the gas pump and bragging in recent days about how it's lower than it had been. To sign that bill and then effectuate those sanctions is a risk for his domestic support.
He has signaled that there might be a big announcement coming next week. So I think the early indications are that he might actually support the sanctions bill, and well, that remains to be seen. But maybe he's made that calculation that it's worth the risk. And
there is a waiver in the bill. He could finagle and sign it and use it as leverage, maybe, to get Putin back to the table. But
And there's a political cost as well, right? There are 86 signatories to the bill. Yeah. This issue, the support for Ukraine, has become a bipartisan issue. He has faced criticisms from within his own party. So you're right, there's an economic cost, but he's also facing a political one.
That's right.
And Peter, beyond the sanctions bill, right, it feels like Russia has been, by the United States, given the ability not to lose, but not the ability to actually win. Right. What would be required to actually allow Ukraine to win, if that's what Trump even wants to happen?
I mean, the truth is, the United States provided tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons under Biden, who's willing and wanted to help Ukraine, and still, as you say, didn't go as far as some people thought they should go. The idea that Trump and this Republican Congress is going to go further than that seems unlikely, which is what Putin is gambling on. Putin is gambling that Trump is going to walk away, that Trump doesn't really care about Ukraine, that Trump actually has other fish to fry with China and trade and tariffs. And that's why he thinks that he can continue to stiff Trump, because then he will have the upper hand in Ukraine.
Particularly on foreign policy, too, is when we see that the president wants to lean into issues that are a win, not intractable.
Exactly. There's a lot to discuss, but unfortunately, we have to leave it here. Thank you all for joining me, to our guests, and thank you to our viewers at home for watching us. For more on the U.S. weapon shipments to Ukraine, be sure to check out Nancy's fantastic reporting at theatlantic.com. I'm Ashley Parker. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week with The Atlantic is provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Ku and Patricia Ewens for the Ewen Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, Charles Hamawi through the Charles Hamawi Fund, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.